Deep in the sweltering, rot-scented jungles of Bougainville, a Japanese patrol closed the net on what they thought was a defenseless American flight crew. Through the dense canopy, the Imperial soldiers spotted a lone, mud-soaked mechanic standing his ground. He held no standard-issue rifle. Instead, cradled in his blistered hands, was a monstrous, jagged contraption of twisted aircraft aluminum, sparking wires, and a salvaged .50 caliber heavy machine gun barrel. The patrol commander sneered, assuming the desperate survivor was bluffing with a broken piece of wreckage. It was a fatal miscalculation. Within seconds, the jungle would erupt, and the enemy would learn the terrifying cost of cornering a man who knew how to turn a dead bomber into an executioner. November 14, 1943. The air over the Solomon Islands was a humid soup that clung to the skin and choked the lungs. But at 8,000 feet, the crew of the B-25 Mitchell bomber, Detroit Iron, only felt the biting wind rushing through the unsealed bulkheads. Technical Sergeant Thomas Callahan hated flying. It was an irony not lost on him, considering his job was to keep the twin-engine beast in the air. Before the war, Callahan had spent his life on the assembly lines of the Ford River Rouge complex in Michigan. He understood machines, their tolerances, their breaking points, the way steel and oil worked in harmony to create power. He didn't understand the sky, and he certainly didn't understand the sudden, terrifying violence of anti-aircraft fire. "Target sighted, Captain," the voice of their bombardier, Lieutenant David Ross, crackled over the intercom. In the pilot's seat, Captain Arthur Penhaligon nodded, his hands firm on the yoke. "Hold steady, boys. Let's drop these and get the hell back to Henderson Field." They were targeting a hidden munitions depot near the Kahili airfield on Bougainville's southern coast. The intelligence had suggested the area was lightly defended, a milk run to disrupt supply lines. The intelligence had been dead wrong. As Detroit Iron banked over the emerald canopy of the island, the jungle below seemed to flash with violent, strobe-like bursts. Before Callahan could even brace himself against the engineer's bulkhead, the sky around them turned into a hailstorm of jagged black flak. The first shell detonated 50 yards off the port wing, rattling the bomber's teeth. The second was a direct hit. A deafening metallic shriek tore through the fuselage. Callahan was thrown violently against the navigator's table as the starboard engine took a 75mm anti-aircraft shell, dead in the cowling. The Wright R-2600 radial engine didn't just fail, it disintegrated. Shrapnel ripped through the aluminum skin of the aircraft like wet paper, severing hydraulic lines and instantly turning the right side of the bomber into a roaring fireball. "Mayday! Mayday!" Captain Penhaligon shouted over the roar of the wind and fire, wrestling with the controls. "We've lost starboard power. Controls are stiffening. Brace for impact." The bomber plunged, dropping out of the sky like a stone. Callahan gripped a structural rib, his knuckles turning white, watching the green ocean of the jungle canopy rush up to meet them at terrifying speed. The descent was a blur of smoke, screaming wind, and the sickening feeling of gravity losing its grip. When they hit the trees, the world ended in a cacophony of shattering glass, tearing metal, and the explosive crack of mahogany trunks shearing the wings clean off the fuselage. The bomber tore a 200-yard scar through the dense jungle before finally slamming into an earthen embankment. Silence, thick and absolute, fell over the wreckage, interrupted only by the hiss of leaking aviation fuel splashing onto scorching hot engine blocks. Callahan blinked, tasting copper. He was hanging upside down, his harness cutting deeply into his collarbone. He punched the release, falling heavily to the debris-strewn floor. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. The smell of high-octane fuel was overpowering. "Captain," Callahan rasped, coughing through the thick smoke. He scrambled forward over twisted metal and shattered plexiglass. In the cockpit, Captain Penhaligon was slumped over the yoke, bleeding heavily from a gash on his forehead. The instrument panel was pushed entirely into his lap, pinning his legs. Lieutenant Ross, tragically, had not survived the impact. A branch had breached the nose cone, killing him instantly. Ignoring the heat blistering his forearms, Callahan jammed his boots against the bulkhead and pulled at the twisted instrument panel with the desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength of a man who knew they had seconds before the fuel ignited. With a sickening groan of yielding metal, he created just enough space to drag the semi-conscious captain backward out of the cockpit, out through a gaping hole in the fuselage, and into the dense ferns. They had barely cleared 50 yards when the fuel tanks caught. The explosion was a concussive wave of heat that knocked Callahan flat, sending a pillar of black smoke high above the canopy. They were alive. But as Callahan watched the smoke signal their exact location to every Japanese soldier within 20 miles, he realized the crash was only the beginning of their nightmare. The tropical sun began its rapid descent, plunging the jungle floor into a deep, oppressive twilight. Callahan had managed to drag Captain Penhaligon another quarter-mile from the burning wreckage, finding temporary refuge in the hollowed-out root system of a massive banyan tree. Penhaligon was in bad shape. Both of his legs were fractured, and the blood loss from his head wound was making him delirious. Callahan had bound the injuries tightly with strips cut from his parachute, but he knew it wasn't enough. They needed a medic. They needed an evacuation. They had neither. "Tommy," Penhaligon whispered, his voice dry and ragged. "You gotta leave me. The smoke. They'll be here soon." "Shut up, Cap. I didn't drag your heavy ass out of a burning plane just to leave you in a tree," Callahan muttered, checking the magazine of his standard issue M1911 pistol. He had 7 rounds in the weapon, and 2 spare magazines. 21 bullets. Penhaligon gave a weak, grim smile. 21 rounds against a Japanese jungle patrol. "You're a hell of a mechanic, Tommy, but you're bad at math." Callahan didn't answer. He knew the captain was right. He holstered the weapon and peered through the dense lattice of vines. The jungle was a sensory overload of buzzing insects and screeching birds. But underneath the natural cacophony, Callahan's trained ears picked up something else. A rhythmic, unnatural sound. Snap, crunch, swish, footsteps. Booted feet breaking deadwood, the sweeping of machetes clearing foliage. Callahan's heart hammered against his ribs. He crept forward, flattening his chest against the damp earth, inching his way toward a slight ridge that overlooked the crash site. Through the broad leaves of a fern, he saw them. A Japanese search and destroy patrol had arrived at the smoldering remains of Detroit Iron. There were at least a dozen of them, moving with disciplined, lethal efficiency. They were armed with Arisaka bolt-action rifles, bayonets fixed and gleaming in the dying light. 2 soldiers carried the feared Type 99 light machine guns. An officer, distinguished by the traditional shin-gunto sword, strapped to his hip, walked slowly among the debris. He barked an order in Japanese. 2 soldiers moved to the nose of the plane, dragging out the lifeless body of Lieutenant Ross. They callously tossed him aside, but the officer knelt, examining the mud around the wreck. Callahan felt a cold dread pool in his stomach. The officer was tracking them. The drag marks from Penhaligon's boots were unmistakable in the soft, wet earth. "They're coming," Callahan thought. He scrambled quietly back to the banyan tree. Penhaligon read the grim realization on the mechanic's face. The captain reached for his own sidearm, checking the chamber. "Go, Tommy. Head east. Find the coast. That's an order." Callahan looked at his commanding officer, then down at his own trembling hands. He had never fired a weapon in anger. He turned wrenches. He calibrated gauges. He fixed things that were broken. His mind raced, retreating to the comfort of what he knew: mechanics. He closed his eyes, visualizing the mangled corpse of Detroit Iron down in the ravine. He visualized its remaining components, its structural integrity, its armaments. The B-25 Mitchell was heavily armed. It carried up to 14 .50 caliber Browning machine guns. The waist guns were crushed. The tail gun was buried in the mud. But the top turret, the Bendix electric turret that Callahan himself had serviced just 3 days ago, had been sheared off entirely and thrown into the brush during the crash. The Browning AN M2 aircraft machine gun. It was a terrifying weapon, capable of firing 800 rounds a minute of armor-piercing incendiary destruction. It could turn a tree trunk into toothpicks in seconds, but it weighed over 60 pounds. It had no traditional trigger, only an electrical solenoid. It had no stock to rest against a shoulder, and the recoil of firing a 50 BMG cartridge from the hip without a fixed mount would shatter a man's ribs and break his collarbone on the first burst. It was a weapon designed to be bolted to the steel spine of a bomber, not carried by an infantryman. Callahan opened his eyes. The tremble in his hands was gone, replaced by the icy, calculating focus of a Detroit engineer staring down a seemingly impossible mechanical problem. "I'm not leaving, Cap," Callahan said, his voice dropping to a low, hard register. "Keep quiet. I need to make a quick trip to the hardware store." The darkness of the jungle was Callahan's only shield as he slipped back toward the wreckage. The Japanese patrol had fanned out, systematically sweeping the perimeter, which meant the immediate crash site was temporarily unguarded. He had to move fast. He found the Bendix top turret, half buried in a tangle of crushed vines, exactly where he remembered seeing it during his terrifying descent. The plexiglass dome was shattered, but the twin, 5.0 caliber barrels protruded from the dirt like the horns of a dead beast. Callahan dropped to his knees, pulling a heavy canvas tool roll from his surviving flight gear. He didn't have a cutting torch or a pneumatic wrench. He had a pair of heavy pliers, a hacksaw, a flathead screwdriver, and his bare hands. Working purely by touch in the dark, his fingers danced over the familiar cold steel of the Browning AN M2. He disengaged the retaining pins, struggling against the sheer weight of the receiver. Sweat poured into his eyes, stinging them, as he wrestled the starboard gun free from its crushed mounting bracket. It fell onto the jungle floor with a heavy thud. It was a massive, unwieldy block of steel. Problem 1. The trigger. The aircraft version of the Browning didn't have a pistol grip or a conventional trigger. It was fired by an electrical impulse, sent from the gunner's control yoke to a solenoid bolted to the back of the gun. Callahan crawled into the burned-out shell of the bomber's radio compartment. He found a 2.4-volt emergency backup battery, heavy but intact. He snipped several yards of insulated copper wire from the ruined comms array. Next, he moved to the cockpit. Using his screwdriver, he furiously pried a heavy-duty toggle switch right out of the instrument panel, the switch used to engage the landing lights. Back at the gun, he stripped the ends of the wires with his teeth, twisting them around the terminals of the solenoid and taping them down with electrical tape from his kit. He wired the toggle switch in line. When he flipped the switch, it would complete the circuit, dump the 24 volts into the solenoid, and release the firing pin. As long as he held the switch, the gun would fire. Problem 2. The recoil. This was the deadly part. Firing an unmounted, the .50 caliber, was essentially holding on to a controlled explosion. The rearward force was over 1,000 pounds of kinetic energy. Callahan needed a shock absorber. He crawled under the severed wing and found the hydraulic strut of the main landing gear. Using his hacksaw, he spent 10 agonizing minutes sawing through the heavy mounting bolts until a foot-long section of the hydraulic dampener came free. He rushed back to the gun. Using heavy-duty parachute webbing and aircraft safety wire, he lashed the hydraulic strut to the rear of the weapon's receiver, creating a crude, telescoping stock. Next, he unbolted a curved plate of quarter-inch steel armor from the back of the pilot's seat. He strapped this plate tightly to his chest and right shoulder, using the rest of the parachute harness. The hydraulic strut would press against this steel plate, distributing the massive kinetic impact across his torso, rather than allowing it to crush his shoulder. Problem 3. Ammunition and handling. He couldn't carry an ammo box. He found an intact belt of 50 BMG rounds, massive, finger-length cartridges tipped with red and silver paint, marking them as armor-piercing, incendiary tracers. He draped the heavy, brass-linked belt over his left shoulder, looping it twice around his torso like a terrifying bandolier, and fed the leading end into the receiver. Finally, he needed a way to hold the front of the weapon without burning his hand off when the barrel superheated. He took a heavy leather flight jacket from the wreckage, wrapped it thickly around the barrel shroud, and secured it with wire. Callahan stood up. He hoisted the weapon. It was a monstrosity. An 80-pound, jury-rigged nightmare of black steel, exposed wiring, duct tape, and hydraulic fluid. The heavy battery was slung over his back in a canvas sack. The wire ran down his arm to the toggle switch, clutched in his right hand. The hydraulic strut pressed firmly against the steel plate on his chest. He looked like half man, half machine, a mechanized demon, forged in the fires of a downed bomber. A sharp crack of a breaking branch echoed through the trees, just 20 yards away. The patrol had completed their outer sweep. They were coming back. A beam from a flashlight swept through the ferns, cutting through the darkness and landing directly on Callahan. A Japanese soldier froze, his eyes widening in absolute shock at the monstrous silhouette standing before him. The soldier raised his Arisaka rifle, opening his mouth to shout an alarm. Callahan locked his jaw, leaned his entire body weight forward into the heavy steel plate, and flicked the toggle switch. The jungle didn't just echo. It shattered. When Thomas Callahan's thumb clamped down on the salvage toggle switch, 24 volts of direct current surged through the frayed copper wire, slamming into the Browning's electrical solenoid. The heavy steel firing pin released with a violent clack, striking the primer of the first 5.0 caliber round. What happened next was a demonstration of raw, terrifying industrial power. The AN-M2 aircraft machine gun was designed to fire up to 800 rounds per minute. In the span of a 2-second burst, nearly 30 half-inch projectiles, each weighing over an ounce and traveling at 3,000 feet per second, tore out of the heavy barrel. The recoil was instantaneous and monstrous. Even with the hydraulic landing gear strut acting as a makeshift shock absorber, the kinetic energy slammed into the steel armor plate, strapped to Callahan's chest with the force of a swinging sledgehammer. The air was driven from his lungs in a sharp gasp, his boots sliding backward inches through the slick, bloody mud. The Japanese scout who had triggered the ambush simply ceased to be a threat. The armor-piercing incendiary tracers, glowing a demonic, blinding, white-hot red, struck him and the massive mahogany tree behind him simultaneously. The tree trunk, thicker than a man's waist, exploded outward in a shower of lethal wooden shrapnel, severed completely in half by the concentrated stream of heavy fire. The deafening roar of the weapon drowned out the scout's cries, the crash of the falling tree, and the screeching of the panicked jungle wildlife. Muzzle flash illuminated the dense canopy in violent, strobe-like bursts of yellow and orange, casting long, nightmarish shadows across the smoking wreckage of Detroit iron. Callahan released the switch. The sudden silence was almost as physically painful as the noise, replaced quickly by the sharp, high-pitched ringing in his ears and the hiss of scorched vegetation. The leather flight jacket, wrapped around the barrel shroud, was already smoking, the distinct smell of burning cowhide mixing with the acrid stench of cordite and vaporized hydraulic fluid. 50 yards away, the rest of the Japanese patrol hit the dirt in absolute paralyzed shock. They were seasoned veterans of the Pacific Theater, accustomed to the crack of M1 Garens and the rapid chatter of Thompson submachine guns. But this sound, the deep, rhythmic, earth-shaking thud, thud, thud of a heavy anti-aircraft weapon, was something else entirely. In the chaotic, blinding flash of the ambush, the patrol commander naturally assumed they had stumbled into a heavily fortified American pillbox, or perhaps an amphibious light tank that had somehow navigated the dense foliage. It was mathematically impossible for a single, stranded survivor to possess that kind of firepower. Callahan didn't wait for them to figure it out. His ribs aching fiercely, he hoisted the 80-pound monstrosity. The ammo belt clinked heavily against his side. The canvas sack holding the battery dug brutally into his shoulders. He felt like a deep-sea diver trying to run a marathon in a lead suit. "Move, Tommy. Move," he gritted out, tasting blood from where he had bitten his own tongue during the recoil. He lumbered backward into the thick undergrowth, moving with agonizing slowness toward the banyan tree where Captain Penhaligon lay hidden. He dragged his feet intentionally, sweeping ferns over his tracks as best he could, while burdened by the massive weapon. When he finally collapsed into the hollowed-out root system, the gun hit the dirt with a heavy thud. He slumped against the damp wood, gasping for air, his chest heaving under the steel plate. Penhaligon was wide awake now, the adrenaline from the deafening gunfire temporarily overriding his delirium. His eyes were wide, staring at the smoking, wire-covered Leviathan resting across Callahan's lap. "Sweet Mother of God, Callahan," Penhaligon wheezed, his voice trembling. "What did you do?" "I brought the turret to us, Cap," Callahan panted, wiping sweat and soot from his eyes. "But they're going to realize real soon that I'm not a tank, and when they do, they're going to get mad." The tactical advantage of shock and awe rarely lasts. Within 10 minutes, the Japanese patrol commander, a hardened veteran of the Manchurian campaigns, deduced the reality of the situation. There were no secondary support weapons firing. There were no orders being shouted in English. There was only the solitary, terrifying burst from the crash site, followed by a tactical retreat. Through the dense foliage, the commander silently hand-signaled his remaining 10 men. They would not charge blindly. They would execute a pincer movement, utilizing the dense jungle cover to flank the American position, while their 2 Type 99 light machine gunners set up overlapping fields of suppressing fire. Back in the banyan roots, Callahan was fighting a war on 2 fronts, the approaching enemy and his own jury-rigged weapon. He unlooped the heavy brass ammo belt, ensuring the feed tray was clear of mud. 70 rounds left. At the Browning's cyclic rate, that was barely 5 seconds of sustained fire. He had to be surgical. He couldn't afford the spray-and-pray tactics of a panicked infantryman. He had to think like a sniper, carrying a cannon. "Cap," Callahan whispered, his eyes scanning the pitch-black tree line. "If I go down, you take my sidearm. You don't let them take you." Penhaligon nodded weakly, gripping the M1911 pistol Callahan had slid over to him. "Make every shot count, Tommy. Make Henry Ford proud." A sudden, sharp whistle cut through the humid air. Instantly, the jungle erupted. From the left flank, a Type 99 machine gun opened up, its distinctive, rapid chatter tearing through the broad leaves. A second later, the right flank joined in. Bullets smacked violently into the thick, spongy wood of the banyan tree, sending showers of splinters and bark raining down on Callahan and the captain. They were pinned. The Japanese infantrymen began to advance, moving fluidly between the massive trunks of the mahogany trees, using the suppressing fire as cover. Callahan didn't return fire immediately. He huddled behind the thickest root, his hands tightly gripping the heavy leather shroud and the electrical switch. He closed his eyes, visualizing the geometry of the crossfire. The Type 99s were stationary, providing cover. The infantrymen were the moving threats. He waited until he heard the distinct crunch of a boot stepping on a hollow piece of bamboo, no more than 30 yards away to his right. Callahan hoisted the heavy Browning over the banyan root. He didn't aim with sights. He aimed with the barrel, trusting the sheer volume of the .50 caliber projectile to do the work. He braced the hydraulic strut against his steel-plated chest, leaned into the weapon, and flicked the toggle switch for a fraction of a second. Thud, thud. 2 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary terror ripped through the darkness. The first round clipped a palm tree, detonating on impact and showering the advancing Japanese soldier in flaming magnesium and wood splinters. The second round struck the soldier square in the chest, the kinetic force lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the undergrowth. The Type 99 gunner on the right flank immediately adjusted his aim, pouring a concentrated stream of fire toward Callahan's muzzle flash. Dirt and wood chips exploded into Callahan's face. Problem 4. Overheating and battery drain. Callahan ducked low. The barrel of the Browning was already radiating heat like an open oven door. The leather jacket was charring. Worse, he noticed a slight sluggishness in the solenoid's clack. The 2.4-volt battery was bleeding power rapidly. If the battery died, the gun was a useless 80-pound paperweight. "They're trying to box us in," Penhaligon shouted over the din. Callahan looked to his left. The second Type 99 gunner was entrenched behind a massive, fallen teak log, pouring relentless fire into their position. Callahan couldn't get a clean angle without exposing his entire upper body. He looked at the weapon in his hands. An armor-piercing 50 BMG round was designed to punch through the hardened steel engine blocks of fighter planes and the armored hulls of coastal patrol boats. "Let's see what you can really do," Callahan muttered. He shifted his position, ignoring the bullets, snapping inches over his head. He didn't aim at the gunner on the left flank. He aimed directly at the center of the massive, 4-foot-thick teak log the gunner was hiding behind. Callahan held his breath, braced his legs, and held the toggle switch down for a full, agonizing second and a half. The Browning roared, spitting a 2-foot tongue of flame. A dozen incendiary rounds slammed into the dense, ancient wood of the teak log. To a standard rifle, the log was impenetrable cover. To the Browning, it was butter. The heavy rounds punched straight through the 4 feet of solid timber, detonating on the other side. The Type 99 on the left flank abruptly went silent. But the victory was short-lived. A warning shout in Japanese rang out from directly ahead. The patrol commander, realizing that suppressing fire wasn't working against an enemy who could shoot through solid trees, ordered a direct, synchronized bayonet charge. 6 men broke from the tree line simultaneously, sprinting across the muddy, moonlit clearing toward the banyan roots, their Arisaka bayonets leveled. Callahan looked down at his ammo belt. 30 rounds. The battery was dying. The barrel was glowing, a dull, angry cherry red, in the dark. He had one chance to break the charge before they were overrun. The moonlight broke through the shattered, smoking canopy just enough to illuminate the nightmare rushing toward them. The jungle clearing, previously a tangled wall of ancient mahogany and thick ferns, had been transformed into a jagged, cratered arena. Across this 30-yard stretch of torn earth, 6 Imperial Japanese infantrymen broke from the tree line. They did not utilize cover. They did not fire their Arisaka rifles. They sprinted in a tight, V-shaped wedge formation, their elongated, hook-quillened bayonets leveled perfectly at chest height. Their faces were twisted in unified masks of absolute, fanatical resolve, their voices joining together in a single, blood-chilling battle cry that echoed over the pounding of the tropical rain. Callahan had exactly 30 rounds left in the heavy brass belt draped over his left shoulder. He could feel the mechanical heartbeat of his jury-rigged weapon failing. The heavy, 24-volt emergency backup battery strapped to his spine was practically boiling against his canvas webbing. It was bleeding its final reserves of acid and electrical charge, the casing warping from the sheer, sustained draw of the heavy solenoid. He could feel the sluggishness in the current, a tactile resistance in the frayed copper wire wrapped around his knuckles. Worse than the failing battery was the catastrophic heat. The Browning AN M2 was an aviation weapon. It was engineered to be cooled by the freezing, 300-mile-per-hour slipstream of the upper atmosphere at 10,000 feet. Down here, suffocating in the stagnant, 80-degree swelter of the Bougainville jungle, the friction of hundreds of armor-piercing rounds was tearing the weapon apart from the inside. The heavy, perforated barrel shroud was glowing a terrifying, angry cherry red in the dark. The thick leather bomber jacket Callahan had desperately wrapped around it was fully engulfed in small, smoldering orange flames, the acrid stench of burning cowhide and vaporized grease mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. "They're on us, Tommy," Captain Penhaligon roared from the mud. The downed pilot had propped himself up on one bloody elbow, ignoring the agonizing compound fractures in both of his legs. He raised the M-1000 911 sidearm with a violently shaking hand, his face pale and slick with fever sweat. He fired twice. The sharp, flat cracks of the .45 caliber pistol sounded like children's toy caps compared to the artillery piece resting in Callahan's arms. One of Penhaligon's rounds clipped the shoulder of a charging soldier, spinning him slightly. But the man didn't even break his stride. The momentum of the banzai charge was a physical, terrifying force of nature. Callahan didn't blink. He couldn't afford to. He shifted his footing in the slick, blood-soaked mud, grinding his heavy combat boots deep into the earth and anchoring his calves against the thickest, moss-covered root of the banyan tree. He ignored the searing, agonizing heat radiating through the burning leather and straight into his left hand. He ignored the sharp, stabbing agony of his 3 cracked ribs pressing hard against the quarter-inch steel armor plate strapped to his chest. He aimed low, dropping his left shoulder to sweep the massive, glowing muzzle from right to left, and crushed his thumb down hard on the salvaged toggle switch. The solenoid didn't deliver its usual, crisp, metallic clack. Instead, it groaned a sickening, grinding sound of failing voltage, trying to force a heavy steel firing pin against a stiff primer. The cyclic rate of the weapon plummeted instantly. The dying battery simply could not cycle the massive, intricate steel bolt fast enough. Instead of the seamless, tearing roar of an 800 round-per-minute buzzsaw, the gun fired with a rhythmic, concussive, and agonizingly slow thud, thud, thud. It sounded less like an advanced aircraft gun and more like a mechanized, diesel-powered jackhammer pounding its way through reinforced concrete. But a slow 50 caliber is still a 50 caliber. The first 2 heavy projectiles caught the soldiers on the far right of the wedge formation at a distance of 20 yards. At that range, the massive, half-inch, armor-piercing, incendiary rounds didn't just stop the charge. They defied the laws of biological physics. The sheer kinetic energy lifted the 2 men entirely off their feet, throwing them violently backward into the dense jungle brush in a spray of splintered wood and catastrophic trauma. Callahan gritted his teeth, tasting blood from his bitten lip, and swept the heavy barrel toward the center of the formation. 20 rounds left. The heavy recoil pounded against his chest with sickening, unrelenting force. Every trigger pull was a car crash. The severed hydraulic landing gear strut, which Callahan had lashed to the receiver to act as a shock absorber, suddenly shrieked. The internal rubber seals, never designed to withstand the rapid, repetitive concussion of a heavy machine gun, finally blew out in a catastrophic failure. With a loud hiss, a spray of scalding hot, vaporized hydraulic fluid erupted from the strut, coating Callahan's face, neck, and goggles in a slick, blinding film. He squeezed his eyes tightly shut, blinded by the burning chemical spray, relying entirely on his spatial memory and the terrifying sound of the charging, mud-slapping boots to guide his aim. He felt the heavy brass links of the ammunition belt dragging faster and lighter across his shoulder. The weight was disappearing. 10 rounds left. Callahan forced his bloodshot, stinging eyes open. Through the smoky, red-tinted haze of the battlefield, he saw that only 2 soldiers remained. They had closed the distance to less than 10 yards. Their bayonets were terrifyingly close, the steel tips catching the orange glow of the burning barrel. The soldier on the left lunged forward with a guttural scream, thrusting his bayonet in a vicious, upward arc aimed directly at Callahan's exposed throat. Callahan didn't retreat. Operating purely on the mechanical instinct of a man who manipulated heavy steel for a living, he screamed back, stepping heavily into the lunge. He used the sheer, 80-pound mass of the flaming machine gun as a crude battering ram. He violently smashed the superheated barrel directly into the soldier's chest, simultaneously clamping his thumb down on the toggle switch. 3 rounds tore through the soldier at point-blank range. The concussive muzzle blast scorched the earth, setting the surrounding ferns on fire and deafening Callahan entirely. The ringing in his ears pitched into a high, sustained whine, drowning out the sound of the storm and the battle. Then, The heavy brass belt slipped freely through the feed tray. The gun went dry, with a heavy, hollow, and utterly terrifying metallic CLAing. The final Japanese soldier, the seasoned patrol commander, leaped over the fallen body of his comrade. He had discarded his Arisaka rifle somewhere in the mud. Instead, his hands were wrapped tightly around the hilt of his traditional officer's sword. He raised the gleaming, razor-sharp ancestral blade high above his head, utilizing the downward momentum of his leap to cleave the American mechanic in two. Callahan was completely empty. The battery was dead. The heavy steel plate on his chest was weighing him down. He had absolutely no time to reach for the M1911 pistol lying in the mud near the captain. Nor did he have a knife on his belt. He had only fractions of a second to make a choice that defied every human instinct of self-preservation. Driven by an explosion of desperate, cornered adrenaline, Callahan grabbed the superheated, glowing steel barrel of the Browning directly with his bare, unshielded right hand. The wet, sickening hiss of searing flesh was instantaneous. The sheer temperature of the metal instantly charred the skin of his palms, burning through the epidermal layers in a millisecond. But Callahan didn't let go. His brain temporarily walled off the catastrophic pain. With a primal, ragged roar, he heaved the entire 80-pound dead weapon upward, swinging it like an oversized, medieval steel club. The immense weight of the Browning's receiver, backed by the desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength of a terrified Detroit mechanic, collided squarely with the descending patrol commander's ribs and jaw. The sickening, wet crunch of shattered bone echoed loudly through the clearing. The immense kinetic transfer completely arrested the officer's downward momentum, sending him crashing violently into the mud. The ancestral sword tumbled harmlessly through the air, burying itself deep into the root of the banyan tree, inches from Captain Penhaligon's head. Absolute, heavy silence slammed back down onto the Bougainville jungle. Callahan stood frozen for a single, suspended second. Then, his muscles gave out entirely. He dropped the ruined, smoking weapon. It hit the wet earth with a heavy thud, the hot metal immediately hissing and sending up a thick cloud of white steam as it sank into the bloody mud. Callahan fell heavily to his knees. The adrenaline dam broke, and the catastrophic pain in his hands finally rushed in. He looked down at his palms. They were blackened, blistering terribly. The skin melted and fused in places from the sheer, unimaginable heat of the heavy barrel. He gasped for air, his lungs burning with the taste of copper, ash, and vaporized fluid. The heavy battery pack on his back hissed ominously, leaking highly corrosive battery acid onto his soaked canvas webbing. With trembling, clumsy wrists, he hurriedly unbuckled the parachute harness, letting the dead battery and the heavy steel chest plate fall away into the muck. He slowly lifted his head, his chest heaving, and looked around. The jungle clearing was utterly decimated. Ancient trees were sheared in half. The foliage was smoldering, and nearly 20 elite infantrymen lay dead or dying in the mid. "Tommy," Penhaligon whispered from the dark shadows of the banyan roots, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and absolute horror. Are they gone?" Callahan stared at his trembling, ruined hands, and then down at the hissing, melted wreckage of the aircraft gun that had just saved their lives. He spat a mouthful of blood and soot into the mud. "Yeah, Cap," Callahan rasped, his voice barely a croak over the returning sound of the tropical rain. "They're gone. The shop is officially closed." The silence that followed the crushing blow of the heavy steel receiver was absolute, but it was not peaceful. It was the ringing, hollow silence of a graveyard. The jungle, usually a vibrant, deafening theater of shrieking macaques and buzzing cicadas, had been shocked into a terrified stillness by the sheer volume of the 5.0 caliber onslaught. Technical Sergeant Thomas Callahan collapsed backward into the thick, viscous mud, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon underwater. The heavy, improvised battery pack slipped from his shoulders, the frayed copper wiring sparking weakly one last time before dying completely in the wet earth. He lay there for a long moment, staring up at the jagged tear in the jungle canopy, where the falling mahogany trees had ripped away the vines, revealing a patch of cold, indifferent starlight. Then, the adrenaline began to retreat, and the pain arrived. It started as a dull throb in his chest, where the quarter-inch steel armor plate had absorbed the brutal, repetitive kinetic impacts of the Browning's recoil. 3 of his ribs were cracked, perhaps broken, grinding against each other with every shallow breath. But that was nothing compared to his hands. Callahan lifted his arms. Even in the dim moonlight, he could see the catastrophic damage. The leather flight jacket he had used as a makeshift barrel shroud had caught fire, and in his desperate, final swing to crush the patrol commander, he had gripped the superheated steel of the barrel directly. The skin on his palms and the inside of his fingers was charred, blistered, and weeping. The agonizing sting was blinding, sending waves of nausea crashing over him. "Tommy!" A weak, rasping voice broke through the dark. Callahan rolled onto his side, biting his lip until he tasted copper to keep from screaming. He used his forearms and elbows to drag himself the few yards back to the hollowed-out banyan root where Captain Penhaligon lay. The captain was a ghost of himself. The blood loss from his head wound and his crushed legs had drained all the color from his face. He was shivering violently, trapped in the grips of a severe shock-induced fever. "I'm here, Cap," Callahan whispered, his voice hoarse from inhaling cordite and vaporized hydraulic fluid. Did you get them?" Penhaligon asked, his eyes glazed, staring blindly into the pitch-black tree line. "The shop is closed, Captain," Callahan replied softly. "They won't be bothering us anymore." Callahan knew he had to secure their perimeter, using only his wrists and forearms, an agonizing and clumsy process. He managed to drag 2 dropped Arisaka Type 99 rifles from the nearest fallen Japanese soldiers into the banyan roots. He couldn't operate the bolt actions with his ruined hands, but he could prop them up as a bluff. He draped a captured bandolier over his shoulder, the coarse canvas scraping against his raw neck. By 0200 hours, the sky opened up. It wasn't a gentle shower, but a torrential, suffocating Bougainville downpour. The rain hammered through the canopy, turning the cratered, scorched clearing into a soup of blood, ash, and mud. For Callahan's hands, the icy water was a momentary, euphoric relief, cooling the terrible burns. But for the captain, the drop in temperature was deadly. Callahan stripped off his own heavy canvas fatigue jacket, carefully draping it over Penhaligon's shivering torso. He huddled close, trying to share whatever residual body heat he had left. It was around 0330 hours, in the absolute darkest depths of the night, when Callahan realized his war wasn't quite over. The rain was deafening, masking the ambient sounds of the jungle, but Callahan's ears, hyper-tuned to the mechanics of his surroundings, caught a distinct, unnatural sound. It was the wet, sucking sound of mud being displaced. A slow, agonizing drag. He shifted his weight, peering over the thickest banyan root. Through the sheets of driving rain, illuminated only by the occasional, faint flash of distant heat lightning, he saw movement. About 15 yards away, near the bisected trunk of the massive teak tree, one of the bodies from the first wave of the banzai charge was moving. The Japanese infantryman was missing his left arm from the elbow down, severed cleanly by an armor-piercing round, and his chest was a mess of shrapnel. By all medical logic, the man should have been dead an hour ago. But the sheer, fanatic discipline of the Imperial Army kept him tethered to the world of the living, just long enough to complete his mission. The soldier was crawling on his belly, inching toward the banyan roots. In his remaining right hand, he clutched a Type 97 fragmentation grenade. Callahan's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his bruised ribs. He looked down at his own useless, blistered hands. He couldn't grip a pistol. He couldn't rack the bolt of the Arisaka. He couldn't even wield a knife. The soldier was 10 yards away now. Callahan could hear his ragged, bubbling breathing over the rain. He saw the soldier's thumb hook into the safety pin of the grenade. "No, you don't," Callahan snarled. Driven by pure, unfiltered survival instinct, Callahan didn't retreat. He launched himself out of the banyan roots, sliding on his chest and knees through the freezing mud, closing the distance before the dying soldier could react. The Japanese infantryman pulled the pin, the metallic ping ringing out sharply. He had a 4-second fuse before the grenade would detonate, intending to blow himself and the Americans to pieces. Callahan slammed his heavy combat boot down directly onto the soldier's right wrist, pinning the armed grenade to the mud. The soldier let out a gargled cry, thrashing wildly, trying to twist his hand free. Callahan threw his entire body weight onto his right leg, grinding his heel into the man's forearm, while using his uninjured elbow to drive a brutal, desperate strike into the side of the soldier's helmet. The man went limp. 3 seconds. Callahan kicked the live grenade out of the man's loosened grip. It rolled wildly through the slurry, dropping into a deep, water-filled crater created by one of the earlier 5.0 caliber bursts. Callahan threw himself backward, burying his face in the mud and covering his head with his forearms. Whump! The grenade detonated underwater. The crater absorbed the worst of the shrapnel, but a geyser of foul, muddy water and debris erupted into the air, raining down heavily on Callahan's back. He lay there for a full minute, waiting for another threat, waiting for another ghost to rise from the mud. None did. The clearing was finally, truly dead. When dawn broke, it did not bring warmth, only a pale, grayish light that slowly peeled back the shadows to reveal the full, horrifying scope of the night's violence. The jungle looked as though it had been subjected to a localized naval bombardment. Trees thicker than a car were sheared completely in half, their white, splintered wood contrasting sharply with the dark green foliage. The muddy earth was violently churned, littered with thousands of gleaming brass casings, and the broken bodies of nearly 24 elite Imperial shock troops. In the center of the carnage, resting against the roots of the banyan tree, sat Callahan. He was coated head to toe in a thick crust of gray mud, dried blood, and black soot. At his feet lay the monstrous, melted, wire-wrapped corpse of the Browning AN-M2 aircraft machine gun, its barrel warped and blue from the catastrophic heat, still lashed to the severed hydraulic landing strut. At 0715 hours, the distinct crunch of combat boots broke the morning silence. "Hold up. Spread out. Keep your eyes on the canopy," a harsh, commanding voice barked in English. Through the dense ferns emerged the forward reconnaissance squad of the 148th Infantry Regiment, 37th Infantry Division. They were led by Sergeant William Bill Donahue, a battle-hardened veteran with a Thompson submachine gun gripped tightly in his hands. Flanking him were Corporal Eugene Miller and Private First Class Samuel Jenkins, their M1 Garands leveled and sweeping the perimeter. They halted at the edge of the clearing, the color draining from their faces. "Sweet Jesus Almighty," Private Jenkins whispered, lowering his rifle entirely. "Did an entire armored column roll through here?" Corporal Miller made the sign of the cross, his eyes wide, as he took in the sheer volume of destruction and the scattered bodies. "Sergeant, look at the trees. They're cut clean in half. Shrapnel didn't do this. This is heavy caliber. Like anti-aircraft fire." Sergeant Donahue didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the lone, mud-caked figure sitting in the roots of the banyan tree. He slowly approached, his Thompson still at the low ready, his boots squelching in the bloody mud. "You there," Donahue called out, his voice a mix of caution and absolute bewilderment. "Identify yourself." Callahan didn't stand. He barely had the strength to lift his head. He looked at the sergeant with hollow, exhausted eyes, slowly raising his forearms to reveal his ruined, bandaged hands. "Technical Sergeant Thomas Callahan," he rasped, his voice sounding like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. "Army Air Corps. My bomber went down over the ridge. I have a wounded officer, Captain Penhaligon, in the roots. He needs a medic, right now." Donahue snapped his fingers over his shoulder. "Miller, get Doc Harrison up here on the double. We got a critical wounded." Donahue knelt in the mud beside Callahan. He looked from the exhausted mechanic to the devastated clearing, and finally, down to the grotesque 80-pound contraption of melted steel, airplane parts, and copper wiring resting at Callahan's boots. Donahue reached out, tapping the hydraulic landing strut that served as a makeshift stock. "Sergeant Callahan, where is the rest of your platoon?" "Just us, Sergeant," Callahan whispered. Donahue's brow furrowed in disbelief. He looked at the melted Browning, noting the crude 24-volt battery setup, the toggle switch pulled from a cockpit dashboard, and the steel armor plate discarded in the muck. The realization of what had occurred here slowly washed over the hardened infantryman, leaving him entirely speechless. "You," Donahue started, struggling to find the words. "You ripped a top turret out of a crashed bomber, wired it to a battery, and fought off a reinforced banzai charge by yourself?" Callahan managed a weak, exhausted smile, his cracked lips splitting and bleeding slightly. "I used to work on the assembly line at Ford, Sergeant," Callahan said softly, closing his eyes as the medic finally rushed into the clearing. We don't like throwing away good parts." Within 20 minutes, Captain Penhaligon was strapped to a stretcher, stabilized with morphine and plasma, and being rushed back toward the American lines at the Torokina perimeter. Callahan refused to be carried. A medic had heavily dressed his burned hands and given him a shot of morphine, and though he limped, he walked out of the jungle under his own power. Before they left the clearing, Sergeant Donahue stopped and looked back at the ruined Browning machine gun, now slowly sinking into the Bougainville mud. He shook his head in a mixture of awe and profound respect. "Leave it," Donahue told Corporal Miller, who had been staring at the makeshift weapon. "Let the jungle have it. Nobody would believe us anyway." But they did believe it. Word of the Bougainville mechanic spread like wildfire through the Pacific Theater. While the top brass couldn't officially sanction a lone mechanic building an unsanctioned, suicidal heavy weapon, the results spoke for themselves. Technical Sergeant Thomas Callahan survived the war, carrying the scars on his hands as a permanent reminder of the night he bent the rules of mechanics and warfare to absolute breaking point, proving that the most terrifying weapon on Earth is a desperate man who knows how to use his tools. Thomas Callahan's harrowing stand in the jungles of Bougainville remains a profound testament to human ingenuity pushed to the absolute brink. Stripped of conventional defenses, he refused to succumb to the terrifying odds of a superior, heavily armed patrol. Instead, he relied on his deep mechanical expertise, transforming the catastrophic wreckage of his B-25 Mitchell bomber into an instrument of devastating survival. This story is not merely about combat. It is about the extraordinary resilience of the human mind under extreme duress. Callahan proved that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't the gun itself, but the intellect and unyielding will of the person wielding it. His ability to adapt, engineering a terrifying solution from dead wires and shattered steel, cements his legacy as a brilliant mechanic who quite literally built his own salvation from the ashes of defeat.